Good morning, folks. I'm a couple minutes early, so we'll wait till we're right on time to start. Alrighty, well, let's go ahead and get started. Some other people may sign on in the next minute or two, and that is fine. So what we're going to do today is finish up our group activity from the other day, going through your examples of the biases and fallacies. I think we have half of group 4's responses and then group 5, and then we'll dive right back into our lecture for today, which hopefully we should finish today, and then we will go from there. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen with that document. There we go. Alrighty, so you have the halo effects, and it looks like Michaela, Alondra, and Jade were in charge of this. And let me look, but I don't know if any of them are here. If you are, feel free to unmute yourself. Nope. Okay, cool. Well, we'll just watch their video. And then kind of go on. So the halo effect is basically if you like someone, that's going to influence all your judgments about them. So like, this is a good person because I like them. And so they basically can do no wrong. And this is honestly how things happen, like people like Larry Nassar. If you follow the story of what happened in US gymnastics, he was the team doctor, and he got away with abusing hundreds, maybe thousands of women and some men for years, because he was a likable guy, and he wouldn't do that. He was a respected doctor. So, definitely, yes, he is a terrible, terrible monster. And USA Gymnastics, the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and the FBI, as came out in the past couple of months, we're all implicated in covering it up, which is lovely. So yeah, this is very problematic. I like how the group put it. You're not giving the correct marks based on their skill. And so let's take a look at, they're talking specifically about beauty bias, which is a big thing. And this is why advertisers use models and folks like
physical attractiveness can have a significant effect on how people are judged in.
I want to just open the link in new tab. Can we do that? No, okay, I accidentally opened preview. That's what happened. Okay. But yeah, this is why use models or celebrities to advertise their products, because you think, oh, this person is attractive, or I like and respect this person's work, and so I might buy that product because of it. And we all can be guilty of this, right? So quick video.
Physical attractiveness can have a significant effect on how people are judged in terms of employment or social opportunities, friendship, sexual behavior, and marriage. In many cases, humans attribute positive characteristics, such as intelligence and honesty, to attractive people without consciously realizing it. Studies show that a better physical appearance contributes to the belief of a person being better, smarter, more successful, more important, and more valuable. In the workplace, a range of studies on the effect of beauty have found that those with a high level of attractiveness benefit from higher salary, quicker promotion, and find employment more easily than those deemed to have below average looks. Most studies place a 3 to 4% difference in payment and opportunities between attractive employees and their less attractive counterparts, accounting for an average of $250,000 more over their course of their working life. This phenomenon is looked for as beauty bias or beauty premium, and today we are going to lay out 6 advantages that go along with being beautiful in life. 1. People tend to believe attractive people as smarter, more successful, more sociable, more dominant, sexually warmer, mentally healthier, and higher in self-esteem than physically unattractive people. 2. Physically attractive people are more sociable and less socially anxious and lonely than less physically attractive people. 3.
Here's a good example of correlation does not equal causation, right? Because they're probably not less socially anxious because they're attractive. They're less because of how people respond to them because they're attractive, right? So there's that third variable.
Physically attractive people are more popular than less attractive people, and people are more likely to have an interaction with people who are physically attractive. 4. Individuals are more likely to give personal information to physically attractive people than less physically attractive people. 5.
This is why, if you've ever walked by those kiosks at the mall, right, where they try to get you to like come over and try their lotion or whatever, they also hire physically attractive people to take a look, to again try to get you to hawk those products or to take those products.
A physically attractive person is more likely to be reinforced than a less attractive person. 6. People pay more attention to physically attractive strangers than to unattractive strangers of either sex. Do you think there is such a thing in life?
So this beauty bias is also sometimes referred to as lookism. And it certainly obviously goes with what is called weightism, which is a bias against people who are seen as overweight or obese. So it's a nice example of the halo effect, but obviously this can happen for other reasons as well. Alrighty, so then group 5, I believe, is all here. Go group 5. So why don't you walk us through your fallacy? I'm sorry, just to remind you, Stacy, Jaden, and Emily. So any of the three of you can talk.
Yeah, I'm waiting on my mic. Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah, sometimes it lags. So our fallacy is basically when you and another person are arguing or debating over something, instead of standing up for your argument, you attack that person's character and who they are to try and like undermine them. And for the first person that came to mind, sadly, was like Trump when he came after like Hillary in the middle of their debate and was just calling her a nasty woman, because that like went viral, and I have a video for that.
I didn't actually make sure I open it the proper way. I'm just going to copy the link and open it in the tab. There we go.
That's part of my commitment to raise taxes on the wealthy. My Social Security payroll contribution will go up, as will Donald's, assuming he can't figure out how to get out of it. But what we want to do is to replenish the Social Security Trust Fund by making sure that we have sufficient resources.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out.
I like that was just that clip. That's perfect. Let me get back to our assignment here. There we go. And TC, I think you're lagging again. So I'm going to just go ahead and open your other links because I'm going to assume you're going to want me to do that.
Okay, yeah.
Go ahead and open them both here. And now that we can hear you, do you want to walk us through them?
Yeah, I actually didn't get to read the second one. I believe Emily had posted that one herself. So
All right, well, that was loading slowly. Oh, I like that this one talks about logical fallacy specifically with Trump. Oh, that's cool. That's great. This is a lot of the ones we've been talking about. That's awesome. That's a really cool link. So you all should still have access to this document, and I will go ahead and I'm going to make myself a note to link it on Blackboard so you can refer back to this, because this is a great resource for some of these examples. Let's see if the other link loaded.
yeah, so on this link, number 6 is the one I was referring to. Like if you'd scroll to it, Kim Kardashian had posted a nude photo of her, and Chloe Grace was like, "This isn't really something young women are gonna want to look up to." Blah blah blah. Just trying to like state like she can use her social media influence for something better. And Kim Kardashian was like, "No one even knows who you are," basically. Like instead of like kind of like I guess like agreeing. It wasn't like a very like big debate or argument, but like I guess Chloe was just trying to be like, "Hey Kim, like you have a bunch of young followers, like you should use your media source for better things than naked photos of you." Oh, hi Simba.
Yep, Simba's here. You want to sit up so they can actually see you? No, I want to be just outside camera. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Of course, we all know who Chloe Grace Moretz is. She's Hit Girl, right? It has been in several other things. But yeah, this is such a good point. I'm thinking of, I forget who they were talking to Mariah Carey about. Might have been Ariana Grande. And they asked her something about it. And she was like, I don't know her. Right? Similar type of thing. You just like try to discredit that person right away. Right? Yeah, so I think that that's a big piece of this as well. That's a really good example. And yeah, you all have already outlined, like, rather than engage in an intellectual manner, you're just attacking the other person. All right, tell us about your bias.
So our bias is declinism, and it's where people think that the past is basically better than the future. And some examples that I found where like rates of like decrease in like crime, especially like violent crime such as property and stuff, which would be this link. And it's just a bunch of, I guess, like statistics or facts.
Yeah, yeah, because everyone always says, well, I mean, we could just make America great again, right? Like, when was it great?
Yeah,
Right. You wanted to go back to when people died of scurvy? Like, I don't know.
and then the second link is showing that people are actually living longer. And I also learned this in my adult development class too. Like, as we like generations continue, like the population with older people is going to get larger than with younger people as well. So
Yeah, that's such a good point, especially with medical advances, right? And this is going to be potentially problematic as the baby boomers all age, right? So if any of you are looking for like a guaranteed career path and you're interested in perhaps working with older adults, geropsychology or working with older adults in psychology, that's going to be a good field to be in for a while. Neuropsychology as well, things along those lines. Yeah, and I like the way you all described why this is problematic. There's people who think that way will never live in the moment. They're always sort of like looking back to like when it was better, even though it might not have been, right? We kind of forget the bad stuff. Like silly example, but a Twitter conversation last night that I saw and participated in was about like getting chicken pox, right? So probably most of you never had to have chicken pox because there's a vaccine. But I was sort of like the last group. I think it came out like a year, the vaccine came out like a year after I had chicken pox. And it wasn't, you know, like the worst thing ever, but it wasn't pleasant. You know, I had them in my hair, so my hair would be like in clumps. I actually still have a scar from one that I must have like itched in my sleep. But I had a friend who had them in her throat and on the bottom of her feet. So she was really miserable, right? And potentially like life-threatening. Yeah, so some of you had it and have scars from it. Yeah. And it's always sort of like almost like a straw man, right? For anti-vaxxers, where they're like, oh, people used to get chickenpox and it was fine. Yeah, but like, if we don't have to, why do it, Karen? Like if someone could, now that we've got this COVID-19 vaccine, if someone could protect me against all of the coronaviruses, which include the common cold, I would take it. If I didn't have to get sick, right? I would do it. And not everybody thinks that way, right? But certainly I don't think that, oh, I would live through it and I'm okay is a good reason, right? Not to protect people from diseases. That's just me. Excellent. Great job on that group assignment, y'all. Hopefully that was fun. I tried to, you know, punch it up a little bit, try to make things a little more interesting. So a couple quick things before I dive back into our lecture. Where do you want to go? You want to just sit on my notebook? Okay, that's fine. No class.
Oh my gosh.
It is fall break. I know, he's the cutest.
He's so cute.
And he's like, I know you guys will never, unfortunately, probably be able to pet him, but he's as soft as a rabbit. So the sweetest. And he's also giant. So like, I know you have a little bit of forced perspective right now, but his head is just like, I don't know if you guys can see, but like, I can't close my around his head. So yes, you're our TA, aren't you? Yes. He's my emotional support cat when I need it. He was really funny last year. He hasn't done this as much this year because I've been in and out. But last year, if like my WGS class, for example, was talking about a really difficult topic, he would like come over and lay with me. It was like he knew that there were tensions. So he's, yeah, thank you. Yes, we all think he's adorable too. And he's so sweet with my daughter, which is perfect. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, no class Monday. It's fall break. No Zoom, no in person. Enjoy yourselves. Hopefully you get a chance to relax. And then Wednesday, we are for sure back in person. I will not be a danger to the campus community, as I was told this week. So I'm just like, I have to laugh now, right? Because it's hilarious. Like, yep, the contact tracer from the Virginia Beach Department of Health told me I was fine, but I'm a danger to the campus community. Anyway, so go ahead and turn on our captions. And if you remember, we were talking about the numbers, right? So this week we're gonna hopefully finish up. If not, if it rolls into next week, that's okay, because our topic is related. Yes, thank you, Debbie. I appreciate the eye roll emojis. If we don't finish it today, next week we're talking about like what we can do with numbers. So it's okay if we kind of end up blending those two together. So when you see things reported in the news, right? Typically what they'll talk about, if they talk about the numbers, is descriptive statistics. So if they're talking about like a poll result or something along those lines, it's typically going to be a descriptive statistic. So it's going to describe some characteristic of a data set. So they talk about like mean, which is the average, median, which is the middlemost number, or the range. But it also can include things like percentages, which we call frequencies of, you know, certain answers or the amount of people in the sample, things along those lines. In scientific journals, including journals in psychology, typically descriptive statistics are just like your first paragraph of your results section. And then you get into much more complex statistics to analyze the data. So this is a way to summarize the data and give you sort of like an overall evaluation of it. And so there's a couple of, honestly, fallacies and biases that come into play here. And that reminds me, when I post the assignment on Blackboard, I will also post the link for the place where I got the fallacies and biases stuff, because it's just a really helpful site. So the law of small numbers is a bias that occurs when we mistakenly assume that what is true or characteristic for a small sample will be true for the larger population. So we tend to just generalize. So I have a quick YouTube video here that discusses this.
Common example, flipping a coin. Assuming the common example, flipping a coin. Assuming the coin is fair, we know that the theoretical probability of flipping heads is 0.5 or 50%. However, that doesn't guarantee that if we flip a coin 10 times we'll get 5 heads. But we can be confident that as we continue flipping a coin indefinitely, the cumulative proportion of heads flipped should get closer and closer to 50%. Looking at this graphically helps to illustrate the concept. I just flipped a coin 20 times and these are the results. After each flip, we'll calculate the cumulative proportion of heads so far. So the first flip is tails, so our current proportion is 0 heads out of 1 flip, 0%. The second flip is also tails, so now it's 0 heads out of 2 flips, still 0% heads. Next flip is tails again, 0%. Then heads, now we have 1 heads out of 4 flips, 25% heads. Flip again and it's heads, 40%. Heads again, and we finally hit our theoretical probability of 50% for the first time. Let's keep going. This graph shows the observed probability approaching the theoretical probability. One common misconception, referred to as the gambler's fallacy, is that if the first 4 flips were tails, you're more likely to get heads on the next flip because the proportion is supposed to even out to 50% heads. This is not the case because each flip of a coin is an independent event. Its outcome is unaffected by all previous events. So if you start out with 4 tails in a row, it's not that you're more likely to get heads, it's just that in the grand scheme of things, 4 tails flips will get averaged with a huge number of flips that are expected to yield an even number of heads and tails, causing the proportion to approach 50% as the number of trials increases.
Okay. So we shouldn't take a small sample of things as representative as a whole, right? This also, I love this graph that they did. This also relates to the concept of regression to the mean, which we'll talk about in a few slides.
Common example.
So small samples show greater variability just because you have a smaller number of things to put into whatever statistical software you're using, right? And so any quirk that one person or one coin flip or whatever you have can really throw off the rest of your data. And so variability is being changeable or showing variation in some aspect. So, you know, our heights in this class, I used heights in my assessment class as an example earlier in the semester, right? And like, I've done this before and had people who were like 4'11" up to people who were like 6'2", right? So you could have quite a lot of variability there. And that's just with people who are adults, right? Imagine if we threw kids into there, right? But if we have a pretty small sample, and let's say we're all between like 5'2" and 5'10", but then there's one person who's like 6'6", right? That can throw off our data because of that. Where this comes into play, and I think I've mentioned this in passing before, is brain scan studies. So brain scan studies are very expensive to do. Essentially, you have to pay for your time in whatever scanning machine you're using, or you have to buy one for your own lab, which is, I think, like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so quite often brain scan studies are very small samples. We're talking like 20 people. And so just a couple links here, and I'll open all of them so we can look. I don't want your introductory offers, Ms. Simon. You know, the idea is that there might be, you know, problems that are sort of disguised by this. There might be problems with the software, which we're not picking up on when we look at the, you know, again, these small samples. And so we can miss these things. And so this is a great opening paragraph. I'm sorry, I just like forgot this opening paragraph until I reread it. They stuck a dead salmon in an fMRI machine, which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and they saw some brain activity, right? So clearly there's something going on, and you have to sort of correct for things, and so you want to be aware of that. And so you want to make sure that when you're looking at it, A, if there is some sort of correction you need to make to your software, to your data results, you do that. And then B, you don't just look at one study of 20 people, right? You also look at, you know, all of the studies together. So this is why meta-analyses in studies that are small samples in particular are so important, because then it allows you to look at all of this data together and see. And so I remember going to a presentation a few years back where someone was talking about the brain research for PTSD. And like one study showed this area of the brain is not active. It's like less active in people with PTSD. But another study with another different 20 people showed that that was like the most active, the exact same brain part. So clearly we need bigger samples, or we need to do these meta-analyses to make sure we're looking at overall trends. Things tend to wash out when you do that. There's actually been, in the area of looking at like gender differences, some really great work done by epidemiologists. What is her name? Rebecca Jordan something did a really good, she's an epidemiologist, and took like psychological data about the brain and gender and found that like, just like PTSD, it kind of all washed out when you looked at it at a global scale. I think there was like maybe one difference. And it's not clear if it's biological or, you know, learned. So these are really important things to look at, because oftentimes these big sweeping generalizations are made, again, from a study of 20 people. All right, we've talked about this a lot. We're going to keep bringing it up because you might be like, Dr. Myers, we learned this in intro psych. Yeah, but routinely when I've taught our capstone research project for the BS folks, and BA people can do it if they want, the Psych 480 project, we have people who mix these up. So when you're actually working with the data, it can go out your head. And so I think just reiterating it can help in the future. So correlation, remember, is an association between the events or variables. It's basically, you just use math to describe how those two variables are related. And again, is it positive correlation, they both go up? Is it as one goes up, one goes down, a negative correlation? Or is it zero correlation? There's not actually a relationship. I also like that one of the ways they described this was by talking about a fallacy, right? So after this, because of this, the idea that if we see two things are related, clearly there must be cause and effect, right? But after this, therefore, because of this, fallacy is also sort of couched in a different fallacy, which is that if we hear something in Latin, we assume that person is smarter and we assume it must be right, right? They probably said some not so scientific things in Latin back in the day, right? And so that's really important to keep in mind. And I think people get that way with like scientific terms in general. People get sort of like, woo, when you use a scientific term, or you'll see people saying things like, if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it. Okay, see what happens if you don't consume dihydrogen monoxide, right? Which is H2O, which is water, right? Like, it's sort of a silly fallacy, but it is one that's fairly common. All right, so I have a couple little videos here. I don't think we'll watch all of the TED Talk, but if I remember, this one is not as long. Yep.
One of the most common problems we come across when communicating scientific findings is the confusion between correlation and causation. So here's a brief guide. Let's look at this graph. Now, along here, we've got the number of people wearing shorts. And up here, we've got the amount of ice cream being sold. And we observe this strong relationship. Okay, this is a correlation or a link or an association. We're not assuming that wearing shorts causes you to buy ice cream, or that buying ice cream makes people wear shorts. I think we can assume there's a common factor behind this relationship, for example, warm weather. Now, this is a very obvious example, but it's remarkable how often this basic confusion happens in science communication. Here's one of my favorite examples. It starts with a study which was called Socioeconomic Position and the Risk of Brain Tumor, a Swedish national population-based cohort study. But we're going to see how the message changed from the paper to the press release to the press coverage. The abstract reported that we observed consistent associations between higher socioeconomic position and higher risk of glioma. That is, richer people were diagnosed with more brain tumours, but they carefully only claim an association. The press release, however, reported that high levels of education linked to heightened brain tumour risk, even though the study was not actually about education. And then we get to what the Daily Mirror put in their headline, why going to university increases the risk of getting a brain tumour. So this clearly implies that the
one thing I'll just say really quick, I don't remember if he gets to this or not, is that typically the scientist does not write the press release. It's typically someone who is an assistant or, sort of staff position at a journal. So that was not the scientist's mistake, and oftentimes they don't get to review the press release before it goes out. But that doesn't excuse the journal from doing it, right?
The university itself causes the increased risk. Maybe it's all that hard work damaging the brain. Of course, you may be able to think of two reasons why this association might just happen anyway. First of all, that richer people live longer, but the authors did adjust for age. But secondly, the authors pointed out that richer people tend to get better health care and therefore are more likely to get diagnosed with an illness. Causation is when one thing directly influences another, and we can only confidently conclude that if we've done an experiment. For example, I might take all the people in the department and randomly allocate them to either wear shorts tomorrow or not, and see whether the shorts wearing group consume more ice cream. But most of our studies are observational. We just look at people and measure things, and we can only then conclude that two factors may be linked or associated or correlated. We cannot say what would happen if we changed one factor. Of course, if we've got other supporting evidence, we might still be able to make some tentative causal claims, even from observational studies. So, how do we communicate correlation? Let's look at some phrases. When reporting a study, it's vital to know whether the claim is causation or correlation. Essentially, has an intervention been done or not? The Science Media Center has suggested some phrases. So, for example, if you can only conclude correlation, you might say linked to or is associated with. If you can be confident about causation, you might say reduces or boosts, increases, can reduce, can boost. If it's sort of in between, maybe there's a good observational study with some strong supporting evidence, you might even say may reduce, may boost, at a push. What you don't want to do is what happened in the brain tumor study when the scientists clearly said is associated with, but the newspaper reported increases. So, you have to be clear whether the claim.
I really like how he lays that out, that he's very clear, right? Which is really helpful. Is associated with, or like has a relationship with, is probably the most common way we talk about it in science. So I am going to skip the TED Talk, but if you want to come back and watch it at another point, she also does some great examples here.
One of the most common problems.
Alrighty, some other examples here that I will open. Note to myself, page 10. So here is a report in Vox. Want to live longer even if you're poor? Then move to a big city in California. And the original paper, which was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, very well-respected journal, is the association between income and life expectancy, right? They didn't randomly assign people to live in California versus elsewhere, right? Then they could say causation. It's typically not going to happen, right? Here we go. Fan in room seems to cut infants' risk of crib death. And in this case, they basically said, it was associated with a reduction in SIDS risk, right? We don't know that that's causal at all. Tooth loss in elders linked to mental impairment. Diet of fish can prevent teen violence. Again, these are things that were just like probably spurious correlations that you find. If you test a bunch of things, you'll find some stuff that's significant, even if there's nothing like that meaningful behind it. Some other examples here. They talk about the gambler's fallacy, hormonal imbalances, the Super Bowl in the stock market. People used to think that if you eat breakfast, it like determines whether or not you'll be obese. Like they didn't look at if people were actually exercising or not, things like that. They talk about risk of death by suicide. So it's higher in men, but women actually, as you can see here, make 3 times as many attempts at death by suicide. Because men tend to choose more lethal methods. So, and we've talked about vaccines, so we're blue in the face. We all know that they don't cause anything other than adults, right? If you get childhood vaccines, they cause adults. All right, so as that guy was pointing out, how can we say, and when can we say causality exists? Well, he talked about interventions, which is another word for experiments. So where you want to control an independent variable so that its effects across conditions can be measured. That's that dependent variable. Random assignment is part of that, where you would randomly assign people to a group so that it's not like you're putting all the men in one group and all the women in one group. So literally some researchers still flip a coin or put names in a hat and draw them out. Typically, since we are a little more modern, people will now use the website random.org, which has random number generators. So if you just want to, let's say we are going to have 100 people in our study and we're going to have 4 groups. I can say, give me 100 numbers between 1 and 4, and it will do it randomly for me. And so the first person who comes in is going to be assigned to whatever group 2 is, the next person's group 4, etc. And one thing I want you to notice is, even though this is truly random, right? Like our coin flipping situation, you will have times where you have like 3 1s in a row or 2 3s in a row, and that is still part of that randomness, right? Random does not mean that they'll just alternate in order. Longitudinal studies are the other way we can start getting at this. And so particularly in my subfield, where we're looking at body image disturbance and disordered eating, right? We're not going to randomly assign people to, like, you know, let's make them have an eating disorder. I mean, we could do manipulations in the lab where we have people like look at media images and see how they respond. But if we really want to know, like, what is a risk factor for developing an eating disorder, we have to do a longitudinal study where we'll like measure folks in childhood, early adolescence, later in adolescence, and see which factors at time 1 predict higher rates of eating pathology at time 2. And there are some very, very good longitudinal studies in my subfield and a lot of subfields that look at this. So I mentioned regression to the mean earlier. Regression in general is just a step up from correlation, basically. Regression allows you to consider more than 2 variables at once. So you can see how multiple things might be associated with one dependent variable. So again, to give you an example from my subfield, just because that's what I know, if we're predicting eating psychopathology, so symptoms of an eating disorder, we might include body image disturbance, but we might also include things like amount of exposure to media, internalization of the ideas the media gives you. Perfectionism is a common one that we see. Self-esteem, things along those lines. So regression allows you to consider all those things simultaneously, which gives you more information about these associations. You still have to say association. You do not know this is causal, right? But it at least gives you a more complex understanding of these relationships. Regression to the mean is that if you have extreme scores, you're going to be followed by scores that end up closer to the mean. So again, I have a video about this.
Which is most effective for helping people learn? Punishment or reward? We'll consider the case of Israeli fighter pilot training, because instructors there found that negative feedback was far superior to positive feedback. If a cadet performed a particularly poor maneuver, they would reprimand him, but they noticed that on follow-up attempts, his performance invariably improved. In contrast, if they praised a cadet for executing a skillful maneuver, his performance on subsequent attempts typically declined. So naturally, they concluded that positive feedback is ineffective or even detrimental, whereas negative feedback is what works. The problem is, this seems to contradict a body of research that shows positive feedback is actually more effective than negative feedback. For example, in studies involving teachers, it was found that if a teacher increases the ratio of positive feedback to negative feedback, that actually increases the percentage of time students spend on task. In another study, rugby players were given a video feedback session following a game. Except half of them were shown their highlights and they were praised for what they had done, and the other half were shown their biggest blunders, their mistakes, and they were scolded for doing things incorrectly. Now, a week later at the next game, it was the players who had received the positive reinforcement who performed the best. And in fact, the difference was not just psychological. Blood tests revealed that the players who received positive feedback actually had higher levels of testosterone than players who had received the negative feedback. I think that's quite remarkable, that even a week post-feedback, you could still see a physiological difference between the two types of feedback. Wow. Well, so why didn't this work for the Israeli fighter pilots? Well, maybe there are cultural differences, and in some cultures negative feedback works better. Or maybe it's task dependent. Perhaps some skills, like learning to fly a fighter jet, require more negative feedback. Or maybe the feedback had nothing to do with the performance of the fighter pilots at all. Maybe they would have performed in the same way regardless of the feedback they received. Go with me on this. Imagine you have 100 students taking a test which consists of 100 true or false questions on a subject they know nothing about. Now, assuming they all answer randomly, we know that the resulting distribution of scores will have an average of around 50. But just by chance, some students will have scored significantly better or worse than the average. Oh, man. If you select the top 10 students whose scores were all above 50 and gave them a second very similar test, you would find that the average of their scores would drop back to around 50. Similarly, if you selected the bottom 10 students, their score on a subsequent test would rise to 50. This is just regression to the mean. Regression to the mean is the reason why if you have a really good round of golf today, your round tomorrow will not be as good. Yes! That is because random chance plays a role in virtually everything that we do. So the outcomes of events are influenced by both our skill and a little bit of luck. So if you have especially good luck on one day, chances are your level of luck will not be as good the next day. Now that sounds a little bit like the gambler's fallacy, which states that...
You all know what the gambler's fallacy is now. We've looked at that several times, but I really like that explanation of regression. Which is this, again, random is random, right? And sometimes we feel like it's not because, look, these people were good at it, so they must be good, but random is random, and error is introduced in every part of our life because of chance, like he was talking about. Figures and graphs are something we'll talk a lot more about. We have a whole couple days. We'll talk about these later, but can be something that we want to be really careful of, just like how a press release comes out, right? A figure can represent well or misrepresent data. And so we want to avoid chart junk, which is unnecessary or distracting elements. We want to look at the axes of a chart. Where is 0? What is the scale, right? And I have a couple examples from your book that I think will help this. Another thing we want to look at is if they're doing something like a pie chart or something like that, do the numbers actually add up to 100%? And Dr. Martorell actually texted me this the other day, and I thought this was such a great example of a bad chart. She's like, you gotta use this for scientific literacy. I was like, yes, thank you. If you add these up, these are way beyond 100%, right? And yet it's represented on the graph as if somehow it adds up to a whole person, right? Yeah, very, very misleading for sure. This is from your book. And so this is the exact same data represented 4 different ways. So what you can see is exactly what I was just talking about in terms of the y-axis, right? So what we have are levels of neuroticism, and they gave people word fragments, and did they, come up with death-related words? And so what you can see is if I start the axis at 2.6 and ended at 3.5, so the whole axis is only 1 point, right? It sure looks like we have lots of difference there. If I were to start the axis at 0 and go up to 10, you can see these aren't actually that different, right? They go from 2.9 to 3.4. I can start the axis at 0 and only go up to 4. So then we can see the difference a little bit more, but we also still see how small it is. If you wanted to do this one, number A, and do it correctly, what you should do is indicate by these double dashes that you 0, and then we skip some, basically. So again, and researchers may not even be trying to be malicious in any way when this happens. Sometimes you plot numbers into Excel, right, and it just does this automatically. But as researchers, it is our responsibility to try to represent our data as accurately as possible. And so we need to make sure we adjust these things before we include them in a presentation or a publication. Another thing that can happen if we're looking at something over time is to look at what time we're narrowing in on when discussing how frequently something happened. So this is actually from my old college where I went to undergrad, Kenyon. This is the paper I used to work for, the Kenyon Collegian. It's their weekly student paper. And they actually got one of the biology professors to make this graph for them, which is great. But what you can see is this is a very short amount of time. And then this is the number of COVID cases they had on campus. And so, and you can see the axis isn't great, right? There's no zero. And it's only, I believe, you know, this got kind of cut off when it was posted online, but I believe this is only like a week, something like that. And basically what happened is students came back to campus from being all over the country, and there were a spike in COVID cases in the village of Gambier, which is 500 people when the students aren't there. That makes sense, right? But a graph like this looks really dramatic and really scary, right? Out of context. You know what? We will stop there because this next bit is more of a new topic, and I don't think I can cover it in 2 minutes. But we only have a few slides left in this one, and then we will have a new lecture that will be related. Again, we will be in person next Wednesday. That's the next time I will see you all. So enjoy your fall break, try to get some rest, and I will see you on Wednesday. I just realized I could have said that out loud. I didn't have to type it. Yeah, we had the same thing.
I have to talk just because I have to tell you this. So I lose my voice all the time. Like if I get sick, my voice goes. When I was working still, like working at the animal shelters, every time I would